Hello, and welcome back to this latest episode of Our Future in Space. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Greenblatt. I'm the Vice President for Science and Research at Orbital Assembly Corporation. In this podcast, we explore the technical, economic, social, political, and ethical considerations of moving humanity out into the solar system to work, play, and ultimately to live. Our species is at an inflection point in its evolution where we now have the ability to sustain life long term in low Earth orbit and soon throughout the solar system. Why is this happening? Well, for several reasons. The dramatically falling cost of launch, which is slated to increase rapidly in the coming years, the exponential growth of computation, the rapid commercialization of low Earth orbit and soon cislunar space, and a growing concern that humans are rapidly outstripping our Earth's capacity to support them. Do we merely survive on this little rock, third from the sun, or expand outward into the solar system and thrive? I'm here with my co-host, Eric Ward, the Vice President for Science, for Engineering Design, excuse me, that's my title, at Orbital Assembly Corporation. How's it going today, Eric?
Oh, it's going really well. I'm really excited for this podcast. Today we've got JN, or Nick Nielsen. He's an independent scholar from Oregon who studies philosophy, civilization, and the future. He's spoken about the future of civilization at several conferences, including 100-Year Starship and Icarus Interstellar. And he participated in the Ethics Proto-Task Force for the Human Space Program and a space ethics panel that was part of the NSS-NIAC-TransAstra Space Settlement Workshop. So really excited to talk to Nick about the philosophy and ethics of expansion into space and this kind of inevitable track that humanity's on. So Nick, thank you so much for joining us.
I thank you for the invitation here. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So to start off, why don't you tell us if you think space exploration is morally justified?
So we're going to start off with the big question.
Oh yeah,
and
let's get right into it.
That is something that certainly gets people going, because there are ethical arguments on both sides of the question, and some of them are really creative. Because I am interested in space exploration, and I would like to see more space exploration happen, and I would like to see, as you say, an inflection point in which we grow into the cosmos and into our role as a what has been called an interplanetary species. The opportunities for moral experience increase exponentially, and there are many things that could be done in space at a larger scale and a larger scope that cannot be done on Earth. And there are obligations we could fulfill in terms of our role, if we have a role in the cosmos. So there are a lot of utilitarian, that is to say, pragmatic. I shouldn't have used utilitarian in that informal sense, because we may touch upon why that's a particular philosophical doctrine. And there are a lot of pragmatic arguments for it, like relieving some of the stress of the industrial burden and pollution on Earth, and the industrial processes being conducted in space, which could also potentially benefit humanity through better pharmaceuticals, clean power production, places for people. You talked about in your introduction, you talked about recreation, and there are recreational opportunities on Earth in zero gravity or microgravity that are not available on Earth. So there are a lot of arguments for it. Then everybody in the space community is familiar with the arguments against spending more money on space. Why should we spend money on space when we still have people starving on Earth? I don't think those are very interesting arguments. There are much more interesting arguments about what could happen if we go into space on a large scale. I can't remember the fellow who wrote the paper, but there's a paper that outlines what are called S risks, which are suffering risks, which are a particular part of existential risk. Existential risks cause a permanent diminution of the prospects for humanity. And S risks are those subset of existential risks that cause massive suffering. So there's one fellow who's written a paper in which he talks about the massive suffering that could accompany large-scale space settlement, because you would have multiple worlds or multiple settlements that could go to war with each other and produce suffering on a scale that would not be possible on Earth. And that's absolutely right. If human beings go into the cosmos on a large scale, well, as the familiar saying has it, wherever you go, there you are. And we're going to bring our human follies and foibles with us into space, which will include the horrible way we tend to treat each other, and criminality, and every kind of thing you would prefer not to associate with human beings, but you know are inevitably going to be in the train of any human settlement or any human expansion.
So I want to actually follow up on that really quick. That's not something I'm particularly familiar with, but you mentioned, an S risk. If we expand into the solar system and we have this, huge civilization, with trillions of people, we have this potential to have war on a scale that would not be possible if we were on Earth, right? And so that, in order to minimize the potential for suffering, maybe we shouldn't do that. But in that case, shouldn't we just stop existing altogether and then nobody can suffer, right? If we had trillions of people, maybe there's a war that involves 10 billion, which is impossible right now. But then there's another, trillions and trillions of people who are now not suffering and enjoying life. So how does that kind of play out?
That gets into more technical philosophical arguments, and particularly that would be characterized as a point of view of negative utilitarianism. So just to give a quick background, everybody is familiar with the distinction between means and ends. And deontological ethical philosophies focus on the means, how you do things. So actions are right and wrong intrinsically and not because of the consequences they bring about. So that comes from the Greek word deon, which means duty. And this aspect of philosophy is dominated by Kantian philosophy, because Kant was the most famous deontological ethicist, and ethics was at the core of his philosophy. So the opposite point of view that focuses on the ends rather than the means is teleology or consequentialism. Teleology comes from the Greek word telos, which means an end. And this tradition is dominated by utilitarianism. And utilitarianism, I should say, it comes in many, many different forms and flavors. So most people have heard of the greatest happiness principle, where you're supposed to secure the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. That's a classic utilitarian ideal. In one of the Star Trek films, they have Spock say the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That's a classic utilitarian point of view. And then, since you've got the slide up there, virtue ethics focus on character, and they focus on virtues and vices. Axiological ethics focus on formulations of ethical problems in terms of moral values. So in terms of utilitarianism supposedly seeks to maximize the utility of your action. Like I said, there's many different formulations. One of the formulations of utilitarianism is negative utilitarianism, which instead of focusing on maximizing the positive value of your actions, it focuses on minimizing the negative values of your actions.
I see.
So once again,
mathematically.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Finish your thought, Nick. I was just going to make a.
I imported the idea of value in the last sentence I used. So you don't have to import values into a utilitarian formulation. However, in what is called ideal utilitarianism, the focus rather than on pain or pleasure or on happiness is a focus on what has intrinsic value. So there are overlaps between these traditions. So the negative utilitarianism would say, utilitarian would say, we want to minimize our harmful impacts. And there are several paradoxes that have been constructed within negative utilitarianisms. Aren't we better off just getting rid of people altogether so there is no suffering? Shouldn't we get rid of what, while we're at it, we could get rid of all consciousness, because anything conscious can suffer, and maybe the world would be better off without any suffering at all. And one of the arguments in negative utilitarianism is the pinprick argument. So is the suffering that results from a pinprick bad enough that it subverts the whole world, that we would be better off with no good experiences at all, just because there's this one bad experience of a pinprick? Now that might not seem like a very solid or substantial argument, but I've given an abbreviated version of it. So there is a question, and there are a lot of paradoxes like this that are related to that.
Yeah, Jeff and I, as pretty big nerds, go to the sort of mathematical formulation of this, and mathematically, right? Well, if there's any suffering and you subscribe to pure negative utilitarianism, well then, yeah, get rid of consciousness. But maybe there's this balance, and I'm starting to think, just naturally, well, can I measure the different values of different types of suffering and pleasure and fulfillment, and weigh them and decide, if an action or humanity or whatever is worth it? And I might be going too far, but.
Well, no, if you could quantify it, I have a thought experiment that I've been writing up, but I haven't finished yet, where you implant a microprocessor in the brain of every conscious creature, and then you can monitor live the relative levels of pain or pleasure, or if you want to monitor something else, if you can think of a way to have a metric for happiness, you could measure happiness, and you could just display it out on a big computer screen. Where is the suffering in the world going on now, and how can we mitigate that?
If I can just interject, I would say, I mean, this is sort of fascinating on an abstract level, but I don't know that we need to implant a chip to be able to know when there's a lot of suffering happen in a certain part of the world, for instance. It can be quite blatantly obvious, right?
Sometimes it's obvious, but there's a growing number of people who are talking about suffering in the natural world. So the suffering of non-human species. So there is a body of thought right now of people who discuss what can be done to mitigate suffering, because the natural world is full of suffering, which is part of predation, which is one of the reasons that Schopenhauer said life is an awful thing that never should have been, because life lives off other life by hunting and killing and eating.
Yeah. Although it's so interesting. I mean, there's a lot of directions we could go with this sort of set of principles that I won't go, because I know you're not an expert in some of these questions I was about to ask you. But I'll just in passing say that the impulse for vegetarianism is an interesting one, to try to reduce animal suffering, but you still have other kinds of suffering, right? Maybe of a lower amount of consciousness, but maybe in sort of an absolute sense, we can still sort of say that the suffering has been reduced. And I think that's why a lot of people are attracted to that principle. But well, I think I would love to be able to. Oh, Eric, did you want to have a follow-up?
There's something else you mentioned I wanted to follow up on, and I think we probably could spend a few hours just kind of getting into the granular details of philosophy and what all these things mean. But we really do want to kind of focus on space, right? That's what this podcast is all about. You mentioned, there are a lot of arguments for and against if space exploration is morally justified. And, I don't think that we'll be able to solve that yes or no here, of course. I think it's an important thing to be asking ourselves and thinking of, but one thing I kind of wanted to follow up on, you mentioned, one of the arguments for is that we might have an obligation to the cosmos, you said. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit and kind of tell us what you mean by that.
In aspirational and idealistic, conceptions of the role of human beings in the cosmos, at present we only have evidence of life on Earth. Life may be very common, but we only know of life on Earth, and we only know of one species that hits our level of intelligence on Earth that is able to deliberate morally about these matters. So if we should find ourselves in a sterile cosmos, and we are the only planet with conscious life on it, and we are only the only deliberating intelligent beings on that life, you could formulate the argument that we have a moral obligation to bring, the values peculiar to conscious beings to the rest of the universe. I would argue that a sterile planet, it has certain values, and there are people who argue for the preservation of natural value that doesn't have anything to do with consciousness or life or intelligence. So you can have a series of expanding concentric circles where you're only concerned with intelligence, or you're only concerned with life, or you're only concerned with the planet Earth, and you keep going out further and further, and it's like a Copernican principle of ethics, of how big you're going to draw your sphere of what you're going to be concerned with. But I would recognize the values of sterile, uninhabited planets, but I would argue that there are values that are incurred, that arise because of consciousness, and further values that arise because of intelligence, and that if this is a state of greater value than the
sterile
universe, then you have an obligation to increase the value you have a moral obligation to increase the value of the universe by extending the values that we have on Earth to other worlds that do not have them.
Yeah.
And in the process of doing that, you would almost certainly be creating new values in space as you create this whole space industry, and people, the saying, millions of people living and working in space, they're all going to have experiences, and some of those experiences will be new, and some of those new experiences will have distinctive moral values attached to them.
Right.
So if we, at the moment, we're not sure that we're in a sterile cosmos, or that there's many forms of consciousness and intelligence out there. We've been looking decidedly for a little over half a century, over what are some millions millions of years of evolution of life on this planet, right? So if we subscribe to this belief that in a sterile cosmos we should expand, because then we spread this intelligence and consciousness which has value, but at the moment we don't know that it's a sterile cosmos, but it might be. Would we have that obligation to expand and spread intelligence and cosmos, at least until we find out that we kind of hit that barrier of, oh, there's other intelligence out here, we don't have to do this ourselves?
We could adopt several different strategies if we were concerned about our impact, which we should be concerned about impact on life and intelligence and consciousness elsewhere. We can start small with and we have started small. We've sent automated probes to Mars, several of them, and we have several in orbit, and some, the Voyager probes are out in interstellar space with records attached to them. So if anybody finds them, they can play them and learn about us, hopefully. And so we've taken a pretty low impact approach. However, if you have millions and millions of people living and working in space, that is going to change, and you will not be able to control all of them. And you certainly could have a scenario where somebody is out mining asteroids and they come across, what if you were to, here's an ethical dilemma, what if you're mining an asteroid with some really incredibly valuable mineral, and you come across a little clump of living cells? Do you tell everybody any about it, or you just put a blowtorch to it and get rid of it and take your mineral?
No, you better tell people. Well, that's me talking as a scientist who wants to know about the world. I think a lot of people would agree. But it could still be a tempting moment for the.
It would be a very tempting moment, and knowing that it's a tempting moment, we have an obligation as a society to provide incentives that, people know. The antiquities trade is a big problem on Earth, because a lot of people illegally, go to tombs and rifle them and then sell them on the black market, because it's extremely valuable. And people in the countries where these tombs are, that they can often get a year's worth of wages for a single artifact. So there's a lot of efforts that have been made on an international scale to educate people that if you find something valuable, bring it to the attention of a museum or find a local archaeologist. And, some people do and some people don't.
Right.
So you can make the effort, and you can alter the incentive structure, though people have a reason to do. And if you properly explain it to people, you can say, oh, you've got this great archaeological site on your land. Your children and your grandchildren can make money on this in perpetuity. But if you sell it to a collector, you get the money in hand, and then it's over and it's gone.
Right. It's a one-shot deal. I was going to say, sorry, actually, I lost my train of thought. Maybe someone else wants to jump in. That's a first.
Yeah, so I had a question here, which you kind of started touching on, kind of the relationship to other life in the solar system. And so far we've talked about, well, if it's not there, do we have a moral obligation to spread intelligence into space? But, if we come across life and whether it's a clump of cells on an asteroid that doesn't get flame thrown, or we, encounter another intelligent species or a spacefaring species, I mean, how do you think about our relationship with other life in the universe, and how does that relate to things like SETI and METI and astrobiology?
Well, I see it so I've sort of sketched this earlier in this conversation. I put it in the framework of axiological ethics, because I said these things have value. And I think that there's a number of values that are intrinsic to human consciousness. The way we experience the world is very distinctive, and other conscious beings would probably experience the world different, so they would have slightly different values. So I would view any other instance of consciousness, or any other instance of life, or any other instance of intelligence as intrinsically valuable, that overall enriches the value of the universe. And it would be in our interest to live in a more valuable interest. So it would be in our interest to live in a universe of greater axiological diversity, as it were. So if we find life, consciousness, intelligence elsewhere, we would want to first off, we would want to not obliterate it, as they say in the Hippocratic Oath.
Right.
Above all, do no harm. And secondly, if we find other life that isn't intelligent or isn't conscious, even, just microbiotic life, would we have an obligation to spread that as far and wide as ourselves and or the life on Earth that we know and love?
Yeah, that's a great question.
But we could base that rather quickly. So one of the most interesting things for astrobiologists now is the knowledge that there are subsurface oceans under the surface of Europa and Enceladus and several of the Jovian and Saturnian moons. And because of the incredible gravitational forces at work, it squishes the cores of these planets, so they're warm inside, and it keeps the water and not freezing. And so there could possibly be life in these. There could be separate. There could be what people called second genesis events on each of these, or they could have because of the exchange of matter in the solar system, lithopanspermia. It could be, one life took root once in the solar system and then got passed around to all of these places.
Or even originated outside the solar system and was transferred, sort of distributed to many, many bodies in the solar system and elsewhere. I mean, of course, there's no evidence of that, but nothing against it either. Yeah.
But that's one of the first things we would want to do in looking at other life, is we would want to look at that life in as much detail as possible and try to determine whether it is an offshoot of we are an offshoot of that life, or that life is an offshoot of us, or if we can determine it's a separate.
Right. I think it's
of life.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nick. I was just going to jump in and say, I think this is incredibly important, not just for scientific, understanding, for people who care about genetics and evolution and origins, but I think it's more of an importance for humans figuring out their place in the universe, to know whether we are separate, unique, together, common in terms of life. Does all life share DNA, or are there different variants on it? But I was going to say, we had a very interesting conversation with somebody from quite a different background. This was Dr. Martin Elvis several weeks ago. And, you may or may not be familiar with his paper that he wrote with a colleague on basically proposing that no matter what we do in the solar system, we should leave 7/8 of it alone, just because we don't know what we don't know. And there's plenty of material out there, plenty of places to build habitats, to explore, to extract minerals. And that for future generations, as well as just their intrinsic value, a lot of the solar system should be left alone. And I guess I'm just really looking for a reaction to that principle alone. Maybe you don't agree that it should be 7/8, it should be some other number, but do you like that idea in principle, or do you disagree with it?
I do like that idea in principle, because the resources of the universe beyond Earth are so great that any expanding human population or post-human population would have, what you need is energy and matter, and there's plenty of energy and matter in the universe. However, we are going to be attracted, partly because of our scientific interest, but partly just because human beings are an exploring and curious species. We are going to be attracted to the places that are the most complex and the most interesting. If you send out probes all over the universe, and 3 of them come back with a beautiful but sterile planet, and 1 of them comes back with a biosphere, what are people going to do? Everybody's going to focus on the biosphere. Everybody's going to want to see that. Well, everybody with curiosity is going to want to see that.
Yeah.
So we're going to be attracted to that, and we can assume, perhaps, one of the sticky things about talking about alien life is talking about the possibility of other consciousness elsewhere and what their motivations would be.
Yeah.
And a lot of worry around that too.
Yeah. And anything else looking out into the universe would have come through a similar evolutionary process to human beings. They would have similar, natural selection functions on differential survival and differential reproduction. So we can be confident, and we can also be confident this probably somewhere near the top of the trophic pyramid of its home world, because the bottom layer of the pyramid of the primary producers, they're not going to get as complex as the apex predators on top. So you can start narrowing down the field, and you're going to get something that might look very different from us, but in terms of its evolutionary psychology, I don't think it's going to be that different. Now, there are people who really, really fundamentally disagree with me on that point, so I'm not going to assert that dogmatically. But I just have to say that as a preface to anything else out in the cosmos that is looking around, they are also going to be interested in other interesting things, in higher levels of complexity, and if they look to the Centauri system with the 3 stars, and they don't see much there, and then they look next door at our sun and they see this biosphere here, and what are you going to want to look at? You're going to want to look at the most complex thing.
Yeah, well, I do think that it's possible that other forms of intelligent life have already found each other and know that life is common, but so far we haven't. And I think that if we ever encounter another species of similar capabilities to us, similar intelligence, I think my own personal view is that we're going to find that so incredibly valuable that we're going to do everything we can to try to preserve that relationship. I guess it's sort of like being, if you were I'm thinking about the dystopian scenario where there's a horrible war and somebody wakes up and realizes that, she's the last person alive in the world, or at least she thinks so. And so she exists for several months thinking, I'm it, this is it. And then one day she meets somebody else, and how the whole world changes at that point. So I think it's a sort of a similar moment for humanity if we make a connection.
It's interesting how the scenarios in fiction tend to divide over the dystopian and the utopian. So you get the really terrible ones, and then you get the really what Freeman Dyson called the philosophical discourse dogma. Was the idea was that there would be all these radio signals out there with people giving their equivalent, transmitting the equivalent of Shakespeare for their species out into the cosmos, and there would be this great philosophical conversation. And only when we graduate up to the point where we can receive these signals and interpret them, will be part of this. I can't remember the fellow who wrote a book called The Galactic Club. He's the same guy who came, Ronald Bracewell wrote a book called The Galactic Club, but he's also responsible for the idea of Bracewell probes, where instead of actually traveling to a place or sending a signal, you send an automated probe that's capable of communicating to another world, and then it wakes up when an intelligent civilization arises in the neighborhood, and then can communicate with it.
Right.
So
sort of like
Dyson
the obelisk from 2001, a little bit.
Yeah, sort of like the obelisk from 2001, exactly. Yeah. So Dyson formulated what he called the philosophical discourse dogma as a way to sort of poke fun at the most utopian scenarios. Given the way I look at things, I would expect there to be both utopian and dystopian consequences, and they would be mixed together, because that's the way things usually are in the world.
Yeah. Isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
Well, we have several other interesting topics.
Let's talk a little bit about the some of the utopian consequences. Maybe looking a little bit closer to home here, as humans get off the planet, we start living in space. I think you've written a little bit about this. What would the good life look like for someone in outer space compared to someone who stays on Earth?
I did pose that as a question, and we corresponded a little bit about that before this show. And all of our experiences in space so far have been, small. The largest number of people in space at one time have been the largest number of people on the International Space Station. We have no experiences whatsoever of millions of people living and working in space, or even thousands of people, or even hundreds of people living and working in space. So whether we go into space and we discover that there are new moral virtues and new moral vices, or whether we discover that there are ends out there for which we are willing to engage in any means in order to realize them, or whether we realize in this that we have new duties. And certainly, I think whatever the answers to those questions turn out to be, they will be philosophically interesting. Whether we can say space makes no difference whatsoever to human experience, or whether we say it changes every aspect of human experience. So in a very narrow way, anything you do in space for the first time is new. So the first time that somebody builds a rotating structure that can simulate gravity, that will be completely new in space. But will that mean there'll be any new experiences at all as a result of it? Some people are just fine with it, and some people get sick and they have to go home because they can't handle it.
Right. Sure.
So we can speculate it on now, but we have no experience whatsoever of large numbers of people. And so, but we do know that there will be opportunities on Earth, opportunities in space that they're not on Earth. So there'll be all kinds of possibilities for sports. So there will be a greater diversity of possible occupations for people, a greater diversity of possible forms of recreation. So there'd be an enormous expansion of opportunity for human beings in terms of work, in terms of recreation, in terms of, people will have views in space, that they don't have on Earth. So we all heard of the overview effect, but there'll also be the experience of, walking over Mars, or going to the top of Olympus Mons, or going and flying through the rings of Saturn just for the thrill of it. So once again, there'll be more things that will be available to us, and so opportunities will expand exponentially.
Yeah,
and
it's
whether
it's interesting how you're kind of encoding within a philosophical framework a lot of things that various folks within the space community have been saying sometimes for decades. It's like all these new opportunities not only essentially motivating reasons for why people will want to go in large numbers. It's not just going to be a few brave astronauts, but some of the things really just scratch the surface of what people might be excited about going into space to do and live if the conditions are favorable enough, but also manufacturing, extending life, making life more bearable. People talk about partial gravity, maybe even being a benefit for people who suffer from things like arthritis, or other degenerative diseases. Of course, we don't know, but it is an untested hypothesis. And
we can fear the unknown, or we can welcome it.
That's right.
But it's coming regardless.
Yeah, it's coming. And those who don't want, they can stay behind. But, there's always going to be a continuum of early adopters to laggards. But, I think if folks who are like, I don't want any part of that, watch this unfold, I think they might change their mind in a couple of decades, if things are going well.
With the important proviso, if civilization on Earth does not stumble and fail, because getting into space requires a substantial industrial infrastructure on the surface of Earth that can build rockets and launch them into space in a consistent and as you were saying in your introduction, cheap basis that will make it possible for all this to happen. And we're not given any a priori guarantee that the industrial infrastructure of the planet will remain remain or exceed its current level. If everything goes according to plan, economies will continue to grow, technologies will continue to improve, the cost of access to space will come down, and people will be able to support themselves more effectively outside an extraterrestrial environment. But none of that is gifted to us. We have to wrestle that away from fate, as it were.
Of course, that's right. Of course, some people argue that going into space is actually an insurance policy against things going very badly on Earth. I think your argument might be a little more sort of a near-term concern, that things go badly on Earth, which sort of tanks all the space exploration activities. But
yes, because civilization could remain viable on Earth for thousands of years, even after it loses the capacity for space exploration, because it takes, like I said, a very substantial industrial base, a lot of capital, the ability for capital formation, a high pool of technical expertise, all of these things, which could disappear like that in any kind of problem. For example, in a catastrophic climate change situation where you have ocean levels going up 100-200 feet, you lose all of the major coastal cities. That probably would not be an extinction event, but the disruption to economies of everybody moving to higher ground and moving closer to the poles and away from the equator, that would be so disruptive that the ability to keep the pace of space launch would probably be impacted pretty severely.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's doubtful that we'll have a completely self-sustaining off-Earth civilization, in time to avert that. So yeah, we have to work.
It's a race against time.
Work for that here now. Right. Yeah.
Yes.
But since you've mentioned that the idea of Earth having a backup to Earth, I'd like to say that I call this the terrestrial abandonment canard, because of all the people I talk to about space, I don't know a single person who says that Earth can be abandoned. We don't need it anymore. We're just going to go off into space and leave you people to stew in your own juices. I don't know anybody who's put anything like that in an article or a paper or a book. But this is the canard that comes up time and again, that people who want to invest money in space want to abandon Earth, and it's just going to be a few billionaires that go and save themselves, and the rest of us are going to stay here and go extinct. And that's a kind of really simple-minded way to approach a problem that is not like that at all. And like I said, bring somebody on your show who actually thinks that. I'd be surprised you could find somebody who actually asserted that.
Yeah.
The vast majority
I don't think we're going to spend much time looking for that person. If they show up, sure, but
the vast majority of people who are interested in space, one of their primary motivations in being interested in space is being able to be better humans to Earth, as it were, because we want to take the burden of the industrial infrastructure off the Earth. Because, like I said, at this point in time, we only know of one planet with a biosphere. That biosphere is, divided by 0, it's infinitely valuable.
Yeah.
And we have
And it
to
works.
protect that.
Yeah,
And it works
pretty
It
well.
keeps us alive.
Even with disruption and no electricity, it still seems to hum along. So,
So what about human behavior, right? So you mentioned, there are some issues like climate change, right? That we need to deal with, right? And there's human behavior aspects of this. You mentioned, some reasons to get off the planet. A lot of people advocate for bringing heavy industry and protecting this biosphere. What about our kind of human behavior, right? Our kind of natural tendencies. I think you mentioned earlier that you don't expect that really to change as we get to space. And I was just wondering how you think this, like what this kind of implies about how we'll live out in space.
I think that how we will live out in space is going to be pretty similar to how we live on Earth, other than the novelty of everything being in space instead of on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So I expect some people to do heroic things and some people to do horrible things. I expect there to be a first crime in space, a first murder in space, first theft in space, all of which will make the headlines if we make it so far that we get large human societies in space in which there is enough room for people to get desperate in space, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
So I don't expect it to make us angels. I don't expect it to unify the human species, which is another thing. Many people in the space community look to space as the ultimate unifier of humanity. I don't look to it in that way, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the idea of unifying humanity I think it's overrated. I think we're better with our local governments rather than attempting to have something that covers the whole planet or covers the whole universe in one regime. I think that actually would be something of a nightmare.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you on that. And I think, I don't remember whether you had suggested this earlier in our conversations or it was somebody else, but the idea of because of the larger range of possibilities in space, physically larger spaces, larger numbers of resources, time and distance being much larger than on Earth, does that open the possibility of people living in more various ways than we have? I mean, we do have some pretty uniform societies within a country anyway, and obviously within regions. Do you think that could actually find more diversity in space communities and people living in multiple different forms of government, for instance?
Yes, definitely. And the inflection point there will be when it's possible to create a self-sustaining community off the surface of Earth. Because then when people are dissatisfied, like the Pilgrims, they can take off and they can go elsewhere, as long as they have access to enough energy and enough matter to make an environment for themselves. We will not be limited to planetary surfaces as long as once we develop the technology and engineering, we can make artificial habitats, which could, as someone said earlier, you could have trillions of people just within our solar system if you build enough habitats.
Oh yeah, easily.
So and I assume that people will go off on their own way and have their own communities that they want to have, which you kind of get in the science fiction television drama The Expanse. Shows you 3 different societies. You've got terrestrial society, and then you've got Martian society, which is much more militaristic, but they're trying to defend their own small world, their own interest. Then you've got the Wild West of the Belters, and then thrown into the mix, you've got the Mormons who have paid for a big starship to go to another star because they want to do their own thing in their own way with their own people. And I expect I think it's a really good science fiction portrayal of the possibilities for society off world, and it's full of both dystopian moments and utopian moments, which is what I said earlier. I would expect from human beings. There'll be some great things and some things that are do not do us credit.
Absolutely.
And as we transition into these multiple communities in throughout the solar system, for example, do you expect our philosophies and ethics to change and adapt? Do you even new things come up during that process?
I hope so. And in terms of the four basic approaches to ethics that I mentioned earlier, you can outline those as, will there be new ends that appear that for which people might sacrifice any means to get there? And so, yeah, there's like creating your own, going to another star and creating your own community. That is an end or an aim that doesn't exist on Earth. It did in the past. You could, if when the world was not fully occupied and divided up according to national boundaries, if you didn't like where you're at, you could just leave and go elsewhere and homestead. And people did that. Although most people chose to not to go into the unknown and stay safe, there were enough people who went into the unknown that it made a difference to how history unfolded. So,
right, and of course the technology was pretty crude at the beginning, so no wonder it was just a few brave, souls. But over time,
life was very hard. If you live in a city where grain is imported, that's a lot easier than going out and having to grow it yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
So there may be new aims for people. So that would be the teleological formulation. The deontological formulation is, would we discover new duties? And in terms of the fact that going out of space would require us to master a large number of technologies, a large number of techniques. We would have to get good at living in space. We'd have to get good at going around in rocket ships, as it were. We would discover aspects of life that we may come to see as duties as a result of those changed experiences. In the virtue ethics formulation, go ahead.
Yeah, well, actually, so this might be a good segue. I've been sort of waiting for a chance to ask you about this idea we had floated in the preparatory conversation of a space bill of rights. In other words, duties is kind of what got me thinking about this. Do you think that there will be or should be a sort of a bill of rights that might be more expansive than one that we enjoy in this country and other, countries that are similar? Or do you think that that's not really a useful construct and, is going to continue to evolve with our technology and our evolving worldview?
I think it will be useful in some communities in which that's the approach. There are many societies on Earth in which these sort of formal what legal theorists would call Roman law, which you make the law and then you enforce it, as opposed to the law that comes from a body of precedent that what previous courts have ruled. I think you'll see if we have a diversity of human societies in space, we will have a diversity of political systems. So if you'd like to put up that one slide I gave you of the 3 overlapping circles of the Venn diagram.
Sure. Here we go.
So since we brought this up in our correspondence before the show, and you brought up the possibility of a space bill of rights, I would put that either in political philosophy or philosophy of law, but these overlap with ethics. And they overlap in a lot of interesting ways that pose interesting philosophical problems. The philosophy of law in present time is very much divided between the dominant legal positivism and natural law theories. So legal positivism is just that you posit laws and you obey them, and that's the way societies function. And there's no idea that it has to reflect some kind of higher law, as it were, or it has to reflect previous precedent or anything else. It's just this is what you get. This is what you voted for. This is what you enacted. That's what law is, and it's nothing more than that, and nothing less than that. Natural law theories tend to refer to human nature and that there are intrinsic goods for human beings, that we want to live in certain ways, and that sometimes people will say that the law should reflect our ethical codes. Some people will go beyond that and say you have a moral duty to disobey a
Right.
a bad law.
A bad law.
An unjust law, I should say. And so that, that's very much a natural law standpoint. The idea that you have a moral duty to disobey an unjust law is a natural law standpoint. And it's the kind of thing you don't get in legal positivism, which, as I said, dominates contemporary law.
Right.
So there's a lot of interesting problems there. And one of the problems, as I see it, go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, I want to hear what problems you see, although I'm going to press you once more on what might want to be part of a space bill of rights, even if you can't sort of weigh in on the whole. I'm just curious about teasing out the difference between Earth and space-based living and whether any of those differences might manifest as I mean, there's one I'm thinking about as a pretty obvious one, that you can't exist out in the vacuum of space. And so providing people with the basics to stay alive are a little different in space than they are on Earth. I'm just wondering if there's sort of more than that example that you might be able to draw out.
I think that we have an analogy on Earth. Now, no analogy is perfect, but it's something suggestive, and that is that space will be a difficult place, especially at first. Maybe come back in 1,000 years, and there's huge cities on Mars, and it won't be a difficult place to live. But certainly for the first few hundred years of human beings in a space environment, life will be very hard. So I think we need to look to communities on Earth where life has been very hard. And we can find analogies, which are particularly peoples who have lived in deserts have a customary code. For example, the Pashtunwali is the traditional customary law of the Pashtun people. It's not a written law, it's a customary law, and it includes a hospitality provision and a sanctuary provision, because in the desert, if somebody needs food and water and you throw them out, they will almost certainly die. And so you are obligated to take someone in by the right of hospitality, which is often also found in Bedouin societies, which is another desert society. So you're obligated to take someone in and support them, and with no concept of reciprocity. I mean, just because a person shows up at your door and asks for hospitality,
you don't owe them.
You are obligated to provide it for them. If they're part of your own tribe, it does create a reciprocity obligation, I should say. But if they're outside your tribe, you're just, and similarly, if somebody seeks sanctuary, you are supposed to defend them with your life. And I see something very similar as an unwritten code coming about in space, because, like I said, it's a hard environment. If somebody is on their last tank of oxygen and they have no more water and they come to your space station, I think there'll be an unwritten obligation that even if it's your enemy, you have to take them in. And I think we could learn something from studying desert societies and things like the traditional Pashtunwali customary code or the Bedouin code to see what it tells us about life in a very harsh environment where it's easier to die than to live.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you brought that up, Nick, because that's exactly the kind of set of conditions I think that we've been thinking about that would need to have a stronger response than certainly how we treat a lot of folks in our own society. I mean, not every country treats their homeless or their destitute the same way, right? But I think if we treated the homeless and destitute in space the way we treat our folks on the streets of American cities, we'd be in deep trouble. We'd be losing a lot of people who don't have to suffer that way. So yeah, I think that's a great example. Anything else on sort of this space Bill of Rights concept before we move on that might be worth highlighting in this bit? Yeah.
I can't think of anything else on the top of my head. I would be, you can adopt a Bill of Rights when you're within a community and you've got a degree of cooperation and you've got an intact infrastructure, because you've got all this stuff in place. And once again, space is a hard environment. 1,000 years from now, I'm sure there'll be a Bill of Rights, and in space. What it's going to provide for people, I couldn't say. But in the first few hundred years, where things are rather more dicey and where life is hard, I think it will be much more about personal relationships and informal codes of conduct that people will take very seriously, because they will know that if they get in that situation, that they may be at the mercy of their enemy to give them air and water and food, and then drop them off maybe at the nearest space station, something like that.
Right.
You
Yes.
can look to a future Bill of Rights as an ideal for a farther future, but in the immediate time, but in the immediate time, most space settlement and exploration is going to be supervised either by very large, very wealthy companies or by national governments, and these kind of entities are going to have their own way of doing things and their own expectations, and they may a company that hires you to go out in space and fix satellites, they might have very egregious demands upon you for what they expect you to do. But at the same time, if they want to keep their workforce in space, they will have to support them to an equal degree. So it may be that private codes within companies or private codes within government agencies may be what sets the tone for what happens later. And if you've got a U.S. base on Mars and a Russian base on Mars and an EU base on Mars and a Chinese base on Mars, you've got already different communities with different expectations, probably with different supply chains, and they're going to there'll be a fellow feeling of the people who are in that environment. Just like the famous Christmas truce in the trenches in the First World War.
Yeah.
The national government didn't want to see people coming out of the trenches and shaking hands for Christmas, but the soldiers on the field had more in common with each other than they had with the distant national governments who weren't there. And similarly, the people on the surface of Mars, they're going to have a lot in common with each other, but they're still going to be coming from different cultures with different expectations, and you can see all kinds of possibilities for cooperation, competition, and conflict.
Right. Yeah, and I think you bring up perhaps a more basic observation about how humans interact in a society, that you can have people who are a member of of governments with very different ideological bents, and yet at the base there may be a lot more in common in terms of the everyday existence and their sort of ordinary daily principles than there are differences, because the governments may be, as you said, far removed. So it makes a lot of sense that people could find common ground, even if the organizations that represent them are further apart. I was just going to say, as maybe my last question to you, I just want to say that this is something that Orbital Assembly, and I'm sure other companies who are thinking about operating commercial stations in Earth orbit or on the surface of the moon or elsewhere are struggling with, that people who may go use the station are going to come from different jurisdictions. They won't all be members of the country that the company is a part of, and yet they're going to be far away. And as you said, crimes will happen. What do we do when something goes wrong and there's a conflict on a tiny space station, millions of kilometers from home? We don't just kick them out the airlock. I hope that wouldn't be the policy, but we have to do something in order to preserve, the community as a whole, while also being as fair as possible to the person who may be under scrutiny. So just wondering if you had a reaction to that idea.
With the idea of spacing people, which I think appears as early as Heinlein's juvenile novels, and maybe earlier than that. And then it's illustrated, it's shown in a very dramatic way in the Battlestar Galactica series. Where they throw people out of airlock all the time. I think that's an idea that comes from people's popular conception of pirates rocking the plank, because it's the same thing. You've got this safe environment and you're pushing somebody out of it and they're going to die. And it's interesting to observe that, while pirates did a lot of brutal things, they also had a customary code that they abided by. There were extra rewards for people who were first of all of the town. If you lost an arm or a leg in a conflict, you would be given a certain amount of gold pieces.
Oh, interesting.
So even people who engage in piracy are they have customary codes among themselves, and they're almost certainly going to be different than the customary codes of other people. You know, when a ship of the line would encounter a pirate and ship and capture them, they would hang them from the yardarms then and there. So because they were representing royal authority, and the pirates were only representing themselves, but they had a code among themselves. And I think it's inevitable that large numbers of people go into space, they're going to develop customary codes, and perhaps different ones. Maybe there'll be one in artificial habitats, and other on planetary surfaces, and others in long distance spacecrafts going to other stars.
Right. It certainly seems like the practical will kind of dominate in terms of a bottom up. I think that was one of the terminologies that you use. I'm sorry, I'm not a philosopher, so I don't remember the term, but the idea of law sort of coming up from people's sort of practical experience rather than being dictated from top level principles.
Yeah, I can't remember the term myself, but a body of precedent, a common law. That's the term. Roman law is contrasted to common law. So common law is the body of precedent from previous court findings. So yes, you could find an informal code becomes a common law just through informal judicial proceedings, and then this adds up to some kind of a body of precedent that people feel obligated to abide by, even if it differs from top-down Roman law that's been enacted and is supposed to be effective in a given community. People find ways to do both to do good and to do ill, regardless of what the law says. And people usually draw attention only to the horrible things that the people do in defying laws, but it's just an instance of people seeing as a result and following their personal conscience, very much natural law observation that people want to do what is consistent with nature, and some people can become very uncomfortable depending on which day you catch them.
Right. Hey, Nick, unfortunately, we caught most of what you were saying the last minute or so, but I think we're getting some increasing dropouts. So we lost a couple of words there. I don't know if it's better now, but do you want to succinctly summarize what you were just saying, maybe in a short sentence?
I think people will defy the law just as often to be decent as to be awful.
Gotcha. All right.
And that's an optimistic take on human nature.
I like it though. That's good news. But I think we're out of time here, so I think we should wrap it up. I wanted to thank you so much, Nick, for joining us. I think this was a really fascinating conversation. I'm sure that we could keep talking here for quite a long time, but it's really interesting to talk about the ethics and philosophy of getting into space. So also, we wanted to thank everybody who joined live and watched the YouTube recording live. Thank you for coming. If anybody wants to try to get a hold of Nick, you can find him on Twitter at Geopolycraticus, and various email and web links that'll all be in the show notes in the podcast and on YouTube. And so, Nick, we really want to thank you. Of course, if anyone has any questions for us, for the show, suggestions for topics, people you want to interview, please reach out to us. Just hit us up on Twitter if you just enjoyed it and wanted to thank Nick or anything. We're on Twitter at Our Future Space. You can also find us on Facebook at Our Future in Space. And then feel free to email us as well, ourfutureinspace@orbitalassembly.com. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening. And Nick, again, thank you for coming and chatting with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me on the show. It was a good time.
Absolutely. It was our pleasure.
Glad you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.